The Valhari Dominion had ruled the outer spiral arm of the Milky Way for 11,000 years. 11,000 years of conquest, of expansion, of absolute certainty that no species in the known universe could challenge their supremacy. Their warships stretched for kilometers, their weapons could crack the crust of a planet from orbit, and their admirals had never once, not in 11 millennia of warfare, experienced the particular sensation of fear. They had come close to it, perhaps. There had been moments of strategic concern, tactical recalculation, even what their scientists clinically described as elevated stress responses. But fear? That was a concept they studied in the psychological profiles of the species they conquered. It was something that happened to others. It was something that happened to the weak. On the morning that Admiral Cathvara received the intelligence report about the small vessel drifting at the edge of the Proxima Reach, the contested boundary zone between Valhari space and the territory of a newly contacted species called humanity, he dismissed it with the casual wave of one of his 4 upper appendages and told his intelligence officer to stop wasting his time with scout ships. He had a war to plan. He had no idea that dismissal would become the most catastrophic mistake in Valhari history. The ship in question was called the ESS Unbroken Resolve, and it was not, by any measurable standard of the word, a scout ship. It was 340 meters of reinforced titanium carbide alloy, wrapped in a layered armor system that human engineers had spent 60 years perfecting after studying every weapons system the Valhari had deployed against the smaller species they had annihilated during their expansion. The Unbroken Resolve carried a crew of 412 men and women, all of whom had volunteered specifically for deep penetration patrol duty in contested space. It was armed with 12 rail-accelerated kinetic torpedo tubes, 8 directed energy weapons arrays capable of sustained fire, 4 electromagnetic pulse cannons, a point defense grid so dense that it had once, during a training exercise, intercepted 917 incoming projectiles in under 4 seconds, and something that the Valhari had absolutely no intelligence on whatsoever, buried in the deepest part of the ship's lower weapons deck, classified at the highest level of Earth's Combined Military Command. The Unbroken Resolve was not a scout ship. It was a warship. A human warship. And there was a fundamental difference between those two things that the Valhari Dominion was about to learn in the most direct and memorable way possible. Captain Sarah Morin stood on the bridge and watched the Valhari patrol fleet materialize out of faster-than-light transit on her main display screen, and she did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply leaned forward in her command chair, rested her chin on her folded hands, and said, very quietly, "Well, they found us faster than we expected." Battle stations. The alarms that followed were not the panicked, shrieking kind that appeared in old science fiction entertainment from 2 centuries ago. They were calm, measured tones, a 3-beat pulse that every crew member of the Unbroken Resolve had been conditioned to respond to through months of training. Within 40 seconds of Captain Morin's command, every station on the ship was fully manned. Within 90 seconds, all weapon systems were online, all armor plates had cycled to combat configuration, and the ship's experimental drive system, the one thing that had absolutely no equivalent in any Valhari technical database, had begun its startup sequence. Chief Engineer Deva Okoye's voice came through the command channel from the engine room with the smooth precision of someone who had run this exact drill 400 times. Drive systems nominal, Captain. Kinetic torpedoes loaded in tubes 1 through 8. Energy arrays charged to 70% and climbing. Point defense grid is active. Good, Morin said. Let's see what they do. What the Valhari patrol fleet did, in those first moments, was exactly what their operational doctrine dictated. The patrol fleet, 7 vessels, each one classified by human intelligence as a mid-weight combat cruiser, moved into a standard engagement formation that the Valhari had used for roughly 8,000 years. It was a formation designed to overwhelm smaller ships through coordinated fire, to box in any vessel that attempted to retreat, and to demonstrate, through sheer geometric positioning, the hopelessness of resistance. It was a formation that had worked against 237 alien species. Morin looked at it on her tactical display, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed her face. "They think we're going to run," said her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Pren Adashur, who was 29 years old and had grown up on a colony world that bore visible scars from a Velhari raid conducted before the war formally began. He had a particular relationship with the sight of Velhari ships on a tactical display. It was not a warm one. "They always think we're going to run," Morin replied. "Send the standard hail. Let's do this properly." On the bridge of the Velhari cruiser Eternal Conquest, which served as the flagship of Patrol Formation 7 Alpha, Fleet Commander Torith Han received the human communication with the expression of a being who has just been handed something faintly ridiculous. He was tall by Velhari standards, with the characteristic elongated cranium and silver-threaded skin of the Dominion's officer class, and he had personally overseen the destruction of 3 inhabited worlds during the Velhari's last major expansion campaign. He was not a cruel being, by his own estimation. Cruelty implied emotion. He was simply efficient. He played the human transmission for his bridge crew, and the smooth, unhurried voice of Captain Sarah Morin filled the command deck. "This is Captain Sarah Morin of the Earth ship Unbroken Resolve, representing the Earth Combined Military Command and the unified government of humanity. You are operating in contested space as defined by the treaty boundary accords currently under negotiation. We are conducting lawful patrol operations. Please identify your command authority and your intentions. We are standing by." There was a moment of complete silence on the bridge of the Eternal Conquest. Then one of Torith Han's junior officers made a sound that, in Velhari culture, was the equivalent of a surprised and slightly contemptuous laugh. Torith Han did not join in. Something about the transmission bothered him in a way he could not immediately articulate. It was not the words were exactly what any vessel would say when trapped by a superior force. It was the tone. In his experience, species who were outgunned and outmaneuvered spoke with a particular quality in their communications. There was always something underneath the formal language, a vibration, an urgency, what as psychological specialists called the resonance of fear. It was subtle, almost always present, and it was completely absent from the human's voice. The human sounded, for all the universe, like someone who had time to spare. "Scan that vessel again," Torith Han said quietly. His scanner officer complied, running a full-spectrum analysis of the Unbroken Resolve and transmitting the results to the command display. Torith Han studied them. The vessel was smaller than any Velhari warship. Its energy signature was unusual. There were readings his equipment didn't quite know how to categorize, which he filed away as interesting, but its overall profile matched what their intelligence files described as a standard human exploratory vessel. 300 meters, low-yield power systems, limited weapons signature. A scout ship. Almost certainly a scout ship. "Respond," he told his communications officer. "Standard surrender protocol. Inform them they are to power down their systems, maintain position, and prepare to receive a boarding party." He paused. "Tell them they will not be harmed if they comply." He added that last part not out of any particular compassion, but because in his experience, it reduced the amount of time species spent making futile gestures before the inevitable. He expected the humans would spend perhaps 10 minutes in frantic internal communication before responding with compliance or with some ineffective show of aggression that his 7 cruisers would erase without notable effort. What he did not expect was for the response to come back in under 30 seconds. What he did not expect was for the human captain's voice to sound, if anything, even calmer than before. "We appreciate the offer," Captain Morin's voice said through the bridge speakers of every Velhari ship in Formation 7 Alpha simultaneously, a technical feat that made Torith Han's communications officer sit up very straight and begin rapidly checking her equipment, because the humans should not have had the ability to broadcast on all their frequencies at once. "But we're going to have to decline. However, I want to be very clear about something. Fleet Commander, and I'm going to ask you to listen carefully, because I am genuinely trying to do you a courtesy here. We are not a scout ship. I understand your intelligence suggested otherwise, and I understand that the distinction may seem irrelevant given your numerical advantage. I'm asking you to reconsider your current course of action before this becomes something that neither of our species can walk back from. You have 7 cruisers. I have 1 ship. I recognize how that looks. There was a pause. Just a beat. Just long enough to be deliberate. Looks can be deceiving. Morin out. On the bridge of the Unbroken Resolve, Lieutenant Commander Adisher turned from his tactical station and looked at his captain with an expression that mixed professional respect with the kind of personal anticipation that a man with scars carries into a fight. They're not going to back down, he said. No, Morin agreed. They never do. Not the first time. She straightened in her chair. Okoye, how's my drive? Ready when you are, Captain. Weapons? All tubes ready. Arrays at full charge. You want the special package on standby? Morin considered for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all the time she allowed herself for what happened next, because she had learned long ago that hesitation in a commander was more dangerous than the enemy. Stand by, she said. But warm it up. I have a feeling we're going to need it today. She looked at the 7 Velhari cruisers on her display, 7 ships, each one larger than hers, each one capable of devastating firepower by conventional standards, each one crewed by beings who had never, in 11,000 years, encountered a species that fought the way humans fought. Adisher, she said. Target their lead ship. Kinetic spread, tubes 1 through 4. Don't fire yet. Just target. Targeting, Adisher said, and something in his voice had changed. Something quiet and certain had settled into it. Locked. Good, Morin said. Now we wait for them to make the first move. They did not wait long. Torathan was not a patient administrator. He had given the humans their warning, as protocol required, and they had responded with what he categorized as bravado, the desperate posturing of a species that understood its situation but had not yet fully accepted it. He had seen it before. He ordered his formation to advance. The 7 Velhari cruisers began moving inward in their coordinated box formation, closing the distance to the Unbroken Resolve at a pace that was designed to be deliberately, psychologically crushing. It was a technique the Velhari had refined over centuries, the slow advance that gave the trapped vessel's crew time to watch their options disappear, to calculate the angles and find them all closed, to arrive at the inescapable conclusion that there was nowhere to go and no possibility of victory. It was designed to break the will before the first shot was fired. On the bridge of the Unbroken Resolve, Petty Officer Dallas from the Tactical Support Station said, quietly, "They're boxing us in, Captain. Standard Velhari Formation 7. I've seen this in the intelligence files." So have I, Morin said. Her eyes were on the display, watching the geometry of the Velhari formation with the focused attention of a chess player reading the board. The distance closed. 3,000 kilometers. 2,500. 2,000. Captain, Adisher said. They're charging weapons. I know. 1,500 kilometers. The Velhari lead ship's primary weapons array reached full charge. This was the moment, in all previous encounters between the Velhari and the species they had conquered, when the smaller vessel either surrendered or made one panicked, futile attack and was destroyed. This was the moment the script called for the humans to make their choice between submission and futile heroism. Captain Sarah Morin made a different choice entirely. Okoye, she said. Execute Maneuver Delta 7. Full power. What happened next was something the Velhari scanner officers would spend the next 3 weeks trying to explain in their after-action reports, because their instruments recorded it clearly but their theoretical models had absolutely no framework for it. The Unbroken Resolve did not retreat. It did not attempt to punch through the formation in a straight line. It accelerated, not toward any of the 7 Valhari ships, and not away from the formation, but sideways, at an angle that should have been geometrically impossible for a vessel of its apparent drive specifications, and in the same instant that it moved, it fired. Not at the lead ship. Not at the closest ship. At the space between 2 of the outer cruisers in the formation, a precise kinetic torpedo spread that detonated not on impact with any vessel but at calculated points in the void between them, and the electromagnetic pulse that rolled outward from those detonations hit both outer Valhari cruisers simultaneously, not with the force of a weapon designed to destroy, but with the very specific frequency that human intelligence had determined, after years of studying captured Valhari technology, would interfere catastrophically with the targeting systems of Valhari weapons arrays. Both outer cruisers went briefly fire control blind. Not destroyed. Not even significantly damaged. Just blind. For 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, the unbroken Resolve completed its lateral acceleration and arrived at a position that none of the 7 Valhari commanders had plotted in their tactical models, because their tactical models had not accounted for a human warship's actual drive capabilities, and from that new position, tubes 5 through 8 fired, 4 kinetic torpedoes, not at the lead ship, but at the 2 ships flanking it, striking their engine systems with the precise, almost surgical targeting. That came from a crew that had drilled this exact engagement pattern for 6 months aboard a human military training facility orbiting the moon Europa. The 2 flanking ships lost propulsion simultaneously. Still not destroyed. Still very much alive and capable of fighting. But the beautiful, 8,000-year-old box formation that Fleet Commander Torathan had deployed with such confidence was no longer a box. It had a hole in it. And the unbroken Resolve was already moving through that hole before any of the 5 remaining Valhari ships had fully processed what was happening. "Come about," Torathan snapped, and there was something in his voice that his bridge crew had never heard before. Not fear. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. Something that might, given enough additional information, become fear. Something that was, in fact, very rapidly moving in that direction. Lock all weapons on that vessel. All ships, weapons free. But the unbroken Resolve was already past the formation center, and it was turning, not running, not retreating, but turning back toward the Valhari ships with its nose pointed directly at the Eternal Conquest, and Captain Morin's voice came over the open channel again with the same infuriating, impossible calm that had bothered Torathan from the very beginning of this engagement. "Fleet Commander," she said. "I'm going to give you the same courtesy you gave me. You have 5 functional ships. I still have 1. I recognize how that looks." She let that sit for exactly the same beat as before. Consider what the last 11 seconds should tell you about how good your intelligence data actually is. On the Eternal Conquest, Torathan stared at his display. 2 of his ships were blind. 2 had lost propulsion. 5 were operational, and they outnumbered and outmassed the human vessel by every conventional metric. By every conventional metric, this was still entirely winnable. But he was looking at 11 seconds of combat data, and he was a being who had survived 11,000 years of Valhari dominance by being, above all else, very good at reading a situation. The human ship had not fired to destroy. It had fired to demonstrate. Every choice Captain Morin had made in the last 2 minutes had been designed not to defeat his formation but to show him, in precise and undeniable terms, exactly how wrong his assumptions were. The scout ship had hit 7 specific targets with 7 specific weapons in 11 seconds of maneuvering that his own best commanders could not have replicated. And there were readings on his long-range scanner now. Things his equipment couldn't categorize, energy signatures that didn't match anything in the Valhari technical database, building quietly in the lower section of the human vessel, that made the back of his mind go very, very still. "All ships hold fire," Torathan said. His first officer turned and looked at him with an expression of absolute disbelief. "Commander, we have them, hold fire," Torathan repeated, in a tone that did not invite further debate. He opened the command channel to the human vessel himself, something he had never done with a species he was in the process of subduing. "Captain Morin," he said carefully. You said you were not a scout ship. I did, Morin's voice confirmed. What are you? Torathan asked. The question came out with more rawness in it than he intended. It was not the kind of question a Velhari fleet commander asked. It was not in the doctrine. It was not in the 11,000 years of precedent. But 11 seconds of watching his formation dissolve had a way of making precedent feel less relevant. There was a pause on the human end. Longer than before. When Morin's voice returned, it was still calm, but there was something else underneath it now, not warmth, exactly, but something that in human emotional vocabulary might be called absolute conviction. We're what happens, she said, when a species spends its entire history being the smallest, softest thing in a world full of things trying to eat them, and then figures out how to build starships. We're what happens when you look at 11,000 years of Velhari conquest and decide that it stops here. We're what happens, Fleet Commander, when you mistake endurance for weakness and patience for submission. Another pause. Briefer this time. We are the unbroken resolve. And that is not just a name. Torathan sat very still in his command chair for what felt like a long time but was, by the chronometer on his display, approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, 2 things happened. The first was that his long-range scanner completed its second analysis of the energy signatures building in the lower section of the human warship and displayed a reading that made his scanner officer inhale sharply and say, very quietly, Commander. I don't know what that is. I've never seen that power signature before. Not in any catalog we have. The second thing that happened was that a second human ship dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of scanner range. Then a third. Then 4 more simultaneously. 7 human warships in total, all of them larger than the unbroken resolve, all of them already moving on approach vectors toward Formation 7 Alpha, and every single one of them carrying the same uncatalogued energy signature that his scanner officer couldn't identify, and the reading was growing, not just on the unbroken resolve but on all 7 of the newly arrived vessels, climbing toward some threshold that his instruments had no way of predicting and no historical data to contextualize. On the open channel, Captain Morin's voice returned one final time before the end of Part 1 of this engagement, and what she said was simple and quiet and carried the weight of a species that had crossed 4 light-years of hostile space to stand in this particular spot and say this particular thing. Fleet Commander Torathan, she said. My reinforcements have arrived. Yours have not. You now have approximately 90 seconds to make a decision that will determine whether this becomes a battle or a conversation. I am genuinely, sincerely hoping it becomes a conversation. But I want you to understand something very clearly before you make your choice. The energy readings on Torathan's display continued to climb. His scanner officer had gone completely silent, eyes fixed on the screen, stylus forgotten in his hand. We have been watching you for 40 years, Morin said. We have studied every weapon you have. Every formation you use. Every tactical doctrine in your 11,000 years of warfare. We did not come out here because we thought we could match you. We came out here because we know we can surpass you. The unbroken resolve was not sent to this border to be captured. It was sent here to be found. Another pause, and in the silence, the energy signature on Torathan's scanner reached a level that made the entire readout pulse red. We needed you to see what we are, Morin said. So that what comes next is a choice you make with your eyes open. The 90 seconds began. And on the bridge of the Eternal Conquest, Fleet Commander Torathan, survivor of 100 campaigns, destroyer of 3 worlds, officer of the most powerful military force in the known galaxy, felt, for the first time in his life, the specific and unmistakable sensation of standing on the edge of something vast and irreversible, looking down into it, and understanding, with total clarity, that the species he had dismissed as primitive and fragile had been, the entire time, watching him. With patient, calculating eyes, and waiting for exactly this moment. He had 90 seconds. The universe held its breath. The chronometer on Fleet Commander Torathan's display counted downward with the quiet, mechanical indifference that time always maintained toward the decisions of living beings. 87 seconds. 86. 85. the bridge of the Eternal Conquest had gone so silent that Torathan could hear the ambient hum of his ship's power systems beneath the floor plates, a sound he had never consciously noticed in 30 years of command, because it had always been buried under the noise of confident, purposeful activity. Now it was the loudest thing in the room. His officers were watching him. All of them. Every being on that bridge had turned from their stations with the instinctive, collective attention of a crew that understood, without being told, that what happened in the next 83 seconds would define everything that came after. Torathan looked at his tactical display. 8 human warships. 7 of his own vessels, 2 of which were running on emergency power after losing propulsion, 2 more of which were only now recovering their fire control systems from the electromagnetic disruption the Unbroken Resolve had delivered with what he was being forced to acknowledge was extraordinary precision. 5 fully operational Valhari cruisers against 8 human warships, with those uncatalogued energy signatures climbing on every single human vessel simultaneously, all of them pulsing with a rhythm that his instruments kept trying to classify and kept failing, like a mind reaching for a word in a language it had never learned. "Get me the Dominion command," Torathan said quietly. His communications officer turned to her panel and then stopped. She turned back. "Commander. The human ships are broadcasting on all standard communication frequencies. Long-range communication it's not blocked, exactly. She paused, searching for the right word, and landed on one that Torathan suspected would appear in no previous Valhari military report in 11,000 years. "It's crowded, Commander. The signal density they're generating is saturating the relay frequencies. Command would receive our transmission approximately 40 minutes after we send it. 71 seconds. 40 minutes to reach command. 71 seconds to decide." Torathan understood, in that moment, with the crystalline clarity that only genuine danger could produce, that this had been deliberately engineered. Not the countdown was the human captain's courtesy, her genuine offer of choice. But the communication saturation, the careful positioning of the human reinforcement ships, the way the formation had arrived not to surround his fleet but to simply be present in every direction his sensors pointed, all of it had been architected in advance by minds that had spent 40 years studying how the Valhari fought and decided, methodically and without apparent anger, how to dismantle it. He was not in a battle. He was in a demonstration. The question was what was being demonstrated, and whether the lesson was meant to end him or educate him. "Get me Captain Morin," he said. On the bridge of the Unbroken Resolve, the communication request from the Eternal Conquest came through at the 63-second mark, and Lieutenant Commander Adasher noted it on his panel and looked at Captain Morin with an expression that asked a question without using words. Morin nodded once. "Put him through. Full visual if they're willing." The main display shifted, and for the first time in the engagement, Captain Sarah Morin and Fleet Commander Torathan looked directly at each other across 300 kilometers of contested space and the entire width of the gulf between their species. Torathan was exactly what the intelligence files had prepared her for, tall, silver-threaded, with the particular bearing of a being accustomed to absolute authority. But his eyes were doing something that the intelligence files had not prepared her for, because the psychological profiles of Valhari commanders consistently described their senior officers as emotionally contained to the point of unreadability. Torathan's eyes were reading her. Actively, intently, with the focused intelligence of a mind that had just received information it needed to process very quickly. He was, she realized, a great deal more perceptive than his initial dismissal of her warning had suggested. Or perhaps the last 63 seconds had sharpened his perception considerably. "Captain Morin," he said. His voice was measured, but she had listened to enough Valhari communications intercepts to hear the difference between Valhari composure and Valhari effort. He was working to maintain this. "Fleet Commander," she replied, in the same tone she had used for the entire engagement. Unhurried. Present. "I want to understand something," Torathan said. "Before this countdown concludes. The energy signatures my instruments are reading on your vessels, my scanner officer cannot identify them. In 30 years of command, I have never encountered a weapons system I could not at minimum categorize." He paused. What are you holding? Morin considered him for a moment. Outside the frame of the visual feed, Adashir was watching her with quiet attention, and behind him, the rest of the bridge crew were doing their jobs with the disciplined focus that 412 trained human beings brought to the work of being exactly where they were supposed to be. She made a decision. Not a tactical decision, those had all been made months ago, in planning rooms on Earth and Europa and the orbital station above Mars where the Unbroken Resolve had received its final mission briefing. A different kind of decision. A human kind of decision. I'm going to show you, she said. Not use it. Show you. Because you asked, and because you deserve to understand what you're looking at before you choose. She nodded to Adashir. Bring the resonance drive to external visible emission. Full signature, no suppression. On the scanner panels of all 5 operational Valhari cruisers, the energy signature of the Unbroken Resolve changed. It did not simply grow stronger. It changed in character, shifted from a pulsing, climbing, undefined reading into something that resolved on their instruments with sudden, startling clarity, like a shape emerging from fog. Torathan's scanner officer made a sound. It was a very small sound. The kind of sound that a being makes when they see something that rearranges their understanding of the universe. Commander, she said, and her voice had lost its professional steadiness entirely. That drive signature, that's not a weapons system. I'm reading a gravity manipulation field. Not gravitic weapons. Actual, controlled, directed, sustained gravity field generation. She stopped. Started again. That's not possible. Not at that scale. Not without a power source the size of a moon. We spent 20 years making it possible, Morin said, and her voice came through the open channel between the ships without any particular pride in it, just the simple statement of a fact, delivered by someone who understood very precisely what the fact meant. The resonance drive doesn't just move a ship, Fleet Commander. It manipulates the gravitational geometry of local space. It's why your formation box couldn't predict our movement. We weren't accelerating, we were selecting a different point in space to occupy and moving the geometry to match. The torpedoes, the electromagnetic weapons, those are conventional. What's in my lower decks is something else entirely. She let that settle for exactly 3 seconds. And all 8 of my ships have it. Torathan stared at his scanner display for a long moment. Then he looked back at the visual feed, at the human woman sitting in her command chair with the patient, unhurried composure of someone who had been ready for this conversation for a very long time. You could have destroyed my fleet, he said. Not a question. A realization arriving in real time. Yes, Morin confirmed, without softening it. From the moment your formation completed its box. I could have used the resonance drive to collapse the gravitational coherence of your formation's center point. 7 ships, Fleet Commander. Clean and fast. You would not have had time to send a distress signal. The silence that followed was the particular kind that occurs when a being recalculates everything they thought they knew about their current situation and arrives at a number that is significantly different from their previous answer. But you didn't, Torathan said. No, Morin said. We didn't. Why? And there it was, the question that Torathan had been building toward through every exchange of this engagement, the question that was really the only question that mattered, the question that contained within it everything that the Valhari Dominion needed to understand about humanity and had catastrophically failed to understand in 40 years of watching them from a careful, contemptuous distance. Morin unfolded her hands from her chin and sat forward in her chair, and when she spoke not just to Torathan but to every Valhari officer on every ship in Formation 7 Alpha who was listening to this transmission. Because we have been exactly where you are, she said. Not us, specifically. Not this crew, not this generation. But humanity. Our species. We spent 100,000 years as the most fragile things on our own planet, no natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning, no enhanced senses, no pack hunting instincts as sophisticated as the things hunting us. We survived by being smarter. By paying attention. by learning the patterns of everything that wanted to kill us and finding the spaces between those patterns where we could live. She paused, and something shifted in her voice, not softer, but deeper. Older. We became the dominant species on our world not by being the strongest, but by being the most relentlessly adaptive. And then we looked up at the stars and we found the Valhari Dominion, and we learned what you did to the Prathi, and the Aleni, and the Koravan, and the 17 other species whose names you don't even use anymore because there's no one left to speak them. The bridge of the unbroken resolve was very still. And we made a choice, Morin said. We could respond the way every species you've ever encountered responded, with fear or with futile aggression. Or we could do what humans do, which is take 40 years, study the problem until we understood it completely, build the most sophisticated warship in the history of our civilization, and come out here to have this conversation. She looked directly at the visual pickup, directly at Torathan across the void between them. We didn't destroy your fleet because we are not the Valhari. We don't want your territory. We don't need your resources. We are not here to conquer. We are here to establish, very clearly and very permanently, that humanity is a species you do not conquer. Not because we are more powerful than you, although, Fleet Commander, we are prepared to demonstrate that we are, but because the cost of trying will be something the Valhari Dominion will spend the rest of its existence recovering from, and we have no interest in doing that to another species when there is an alternative. The chronometer on Torathan's display reached 0. Nothing happened. No weapons fired. No gravity field collapsed. The unbroken resolve simply sat in space, all 8 human warships simply sat in space, and Captain Sarah Morin simply looked at Fleet Commander Torathan and waited, with the bottomless patience of a species that had learned patience in the darkness of an ancient world and never forgotten how to use it. Torathan made his decision in the 4 seconds after the countdown concluded. In the context of his career, it was the fastest he had ever made a decision of this magnitude. In the context of what he now understood about humanity, he suspected it was about 4 seconds slower than they had anticipated. "Stand down weapons," he said to his bridge crew, and the words came out with a steadiness he was genuinely proud of, given the scale of what was happening inside his understanding of the universe. "Signal all ships in Formation 7 Alpha, stand down weapons, hold position. Do not activate drives." He looked at the visual feed. "Captain Morin. I am not empowered to speak for the Valhari Dominion. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," Morin said. "I'm not asking you to." "What are you asking?" "I'm asking you to go back to the Dominion," she said, "and tell them exactly what happened here today. All of it. The formation, the 11 seconds, the resonance drive, the conversation. Tell them precisely what humanity showed you and precisely what humanity chose not to do with it. Tell them that we are sending a formal diplomatic delegation to the Valhari home system in 90 days, and that we would like to discuss a framework for coexistence that does not require either of our species to spend the next century in a war that we are confident we can win but have absolutely no desire to fight." She paused. "And tell them that the unbroken resolve will be escorting that delegation. Personally." Something moved through Torathan's expression that was not quite any emotion the Valhari had a name for, a compound thing, layered and complex, made up of parts that included reluctant admiration, recalibrated respect, and something at the very base of it that was, he would later reflect in his private logs, the first time he had ever felt genuinely uncertain about the future in a way that did not feel entirely like a threat. "And if the Dominion refuses the delegation?" he asked. Morin considered the question with the same measured attention she had given everything in this engagement. "Then the unbroken resolve comes back," she said simply. "And this time we bring the rest of the fleet." There was no threat in her voice. No heat, no anger, no performance of aggression. Just the calm, complete statement of a fact, delivered by someone who meant every word of it and wanted him to understand that she meant every word of it, and that the distinction between a threat and a promise was one that humanity understood very precisely. Torathan found he had nothing to add. He nodded, a gesture he had learned from the intelligence files was significant in human communication, and which felt, in this moment, like the most honest response available to him. 90 days, he said. 90 days, Morin confirmed. The visual feed closed. On the bridge of the Unbroken Resolve, the silence lasted for approximately 4 seconds after the connection dropped. Then Petty Officer Dallas let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for quite some time, and from the engine room, Chief Engineer Okoye's voice came through the command channel with all the dignified restraint of a woman who had spent the entire engagement managing a gravity manipulation drive while watching a Velhari fleet try to box in her ship. "Captain," Okoye said. "Permission to be briefly and professionally delighted." "Granted," Morin said. "Be brief." What followed from the engine room was a sound that was entirely unprofessional and completely genuine and lasted approximately 6 seconds before Okoye recovered herself and reported, in a perfectly composed voice, that all drive systems were nominal and ready for whatever came next. On the bridge, Adashir had turned back to his tactical display, watching the Velhari formation begin the slow, careful process of recovery, the 2 ships with damaged propulsion being moved by their companions, the formation reshaping itself not into a combat configuration but into a withdrawal pattern, turning toward the direction of Velhari space with the deliberate, considered movements of ships whose commanders were doing a great deal of thinking. "Think Torathan will tell them the truth?" Adashir asked. "All of it?" "Yes," Morin said, without hesitation. "Because he's good at his job, and he knows that if he softens any part of it, the Dominion will arrive at this border with a larger fleet and worse assumptions, and then this conversation becomes a war." She watched the Velhari ships on her display for a moment. "He doesn't want that war any more than we do. He just didn't know that until today." "Think the Dominion will take the meeting?" "I think the Dominion has spent 11,000 years in a universe where the rules were simple," Morin said. "Where they were the strongest thing in the room, and everything else adjusted to that fact. Today, for the first time in 11,000 years, they met something that didn't adjust. Something that did its homework, showed up prepared, and gave them a choice instead of just a fight." She finally allowed herself to lean back in her command chair, the first time she had changed her posture since battle stations had been called. "That's a hard thing for any species to process. It was a hard thing for us to process, once, a long time ago. But they'll process it. And when they do, they'll come to the table, because the alternative is a war with a species that built a gravity drive in secret, hid it from their best intelligence assets for 20 years, and then used it to win an engagement without destroying a single enemy vessel." She looked at the display one more time. The Velhari ships were nearly at the edge of scanner range now, moving back toward the space they had come from, carrying with them the weight of everything they had seen today and everything they needed to understand about it before 90 days had passed. "The Dominion didn't get to 11,000 years by being stupid," Morin said. "They got there by being the strongest. Today, they found out that strongest and smartest are different things, and that a species that is both is something new in their experience." She paused. "They'll come to the table." Adashir was quiet for a moment, watching the last Velhari ship disappear from scanner range. Then he said, "And if they don't? If they come back with 20 ships instead of 7, and they skip the conversation and go straight to maximum force?" Morin looked at him, and her expression was the same expression she had been wearing for the entire engagement, calm, present, clear-eyed, carrying no illusion about the nature of the universe or the species that lived in it. "Then we find out if the resonance drive works as well at a fleet scale as the theoretical models suggest," she said. "And I am very confident in our engineers." The Unbroken Resolve and its 7 companion ships held position at the edge of the Proxima Reach for 6 more hours after the Velhari formation departed, running continuous scans, logging every piece of data from the engagement for transmission to Earth Combined Military Command, and maintaining the kind of disciplined post-engagement routine that 412 trained human beings executed with the professionalism of people who understood that the work did not stop when the immediate crisis resolved. Captain Morin wrote her after-action report in the same methodical, detailed manner that she had applied to every report in her 16 years of command. She described the engagement from initial contact to the departure of Formation 7 Alpha, annotated every tactical decision and its reasoning, noted the performance of every weapons system and drive component, and included a psychological assessment of Fleet Commander Torathan that she expected the Intelligence Division would find extremely useful. At the very end, in the section marked Commander's Observations, she wrote a single paragraph that she suspected would be quoted in military history texts for a very long time if things went the way she believed they would, and possibly for a much longer time if they didn't. It read, "The Velhari Dominion is not evil. It is not uniquely cruel. It is powerful, and it has operated for 11,000 years in a universe that rewarded power above everything else, in the absence of anything powerful enough to offer it a different model. Today we offered it that model. Whether it accepts the alternative remains to be seen. What is not in question is this: humanity is no longer the newest, smallest, least understood presence in this region of space. We are known now. Known in the specific way that matters most, not as a curiosity, not as a target, not as a species to be absorbed into the Dominion's long history of conquests. We are known as a species that came to the table with gravity drives and rail cannons and the complete tactical doctrine of a civilization 11,000 years older than ours, and chose to use all of it to start a conversation rather than a war. That choice, and the capability behind it, is what humanity brought to this border today. It is what the unbroken resolve was built to carry. And it is what we will carry to the diplomatic table in 90 days. Armed with every weapon we have and every intention of not using a single one of them. That is what it means to be human, in a galaxy that is still learning what the word means. 90 days later, the unbroken resolve arrived at the outer boundary of the Velhari home system with a diplomatic delegation of 12, flying a flag of formal contact that humanity had designed for exactly this moment, a moment that Earth's leadership had been planning for longer than most of the crew of the unbroken resolve had been alive. They were met, at the boundary, by a Velhari escort fleet of 40 ships. Not a combat formation. A formal military honor guard, which was a distinction that humans understood and the intelligence division had confirmed the Velhari used for diplomatic arrivals of species they considered worthy of the gesture. Leading the escort was a single cruiser that Captain Morin recognized on her tactical display before the identifier even resolved on her screen. The Eternal Conquest. Fleet Commander Torathan had come personally. When the formal contact channel opened and Torathan's voice came through for the first time since the engagement at the Proxima Reach, he said only, "Captain Morin. Welcome to Velhari space. The High Dominion Council is prepared to receive your delegation." And Morin said, "Thank you, Fleet Commander. We're looking forward to the conversation." And it was a conversation. A long one. A difficult one. A conversation between a civilization that had built its entire identity on being the most powerful force in the galaxy, and a species that had spent its entire history turning disadvantage into advantage and finding ways to survive things that should have ended them. There were sessions that lasted through the equivalent of 3 Velhari days without break. There were moments of profound misunderstanding that required the patient, careful work of linguists and psychologists and diplomats who had spent their careers preparing for exactly this. There were moments when the entire framework nearly collapsed under the weight of 11,000 years of Velhari assumptions meeting the particular, stubborn, immovable human conviction that a better arrangement was possible and that the work of building it was worth doing regardless of how long it took. But there was never, at any point in those negotiations, any ambiguity about the fundamental balance of the room. Because the unbroken resolve was in orbit above the Velhari home world the entire time, and every delegate in that room knew what it was carrying in its lower decks, and every delegate in that room knew that the human delegation had not come to demand or to conquer or to impose, but to build something that had never existed in this part of the galaxy before. Something that the Velhari, in 11,000 years of expansion, had never thought to attempt. A framework of equals. It took 8 months. It was imperfect, as all frameworks between imperfect beings are imperfect. It required revisiting and rebuilding and renegotiating in the years that followed, as the Velhari Dominion learned, slowly, with the particular difficulty of a civilization unlearning 11,000 years of habit, that power shared thoughtfully was not power diminished. And throughout all of it, the unbroken resolve continued its patrols, continued its presence, continued to be exactly what Captain Morin had described it as on that day at the Proxima Reach, a ship whose name was not just a name. There were other engagements in those years. Other Velhari commanders who did not get Torathan's message as clearly as it was intended, who arrived at the border with the old certainty and the old contempt and the old assumption that the ship on the scanner was a scout ship, something small and manageable and alone. None of those engagements lasted long. None of them ended in destroyed ships, on either side, because the crew of the Unbroken Resolve had been trained by a captain who believed with her entire professional soul that a fight you won without casualties on either side was the only kind of fight worth being in. But each of those engagements ended the same way, with a Velhari commander sitting very still in their command chair, looking at scanner readings that their instruments couldn't categorize, listening to a calm human voice on an open channel, and making the same calculation that Torathan had made in 90 seconds at the Proxima Reach. And each time, they came to the same conclusion. And each time, they went back to the Dominion carrying the same message. Humanity is not a scout ship. Humanity is not a curiosity. Humanity is not a target. Humanity is not something that adjusts to the universe's existing rules and accepts whatever position those rules assign to it. Humanity is something the universe had not encountered before, a species that emerged from fragility and turned it into a philosophy, that built its greatest weapon and then used it to offer a handshake, that came to the edge of the known galaxy not to conquer and not to hide but to plant its feet in the contested space between what was and what could be, and say, quietly and without anger and with absolute, immovable conviction, this far. And then we talked, I in the archive of the Velhari Dominion High Command, in the restricted section where records of military engagements were kept for the education of future commanders. The file on Formation 7 Alpha's encounter at the Proxima Reach was flagged with a notation system the Velhari used for engagements of unusual strategic significance. Of the 237 alien species the Velhari had encountered in their history, only one file carried the notation at the highest level, a designation that translated, roughly, into the human concept of a turning point. The entry read as follows: Engagement Reference 7 Alpha Proxima. Human Vessel Classification, Warship. Human Species Classification, Peer. Recommended Study for all command-level officers. Duration of engagement, 11 seconds of combat action. Duration of strategic impact, ongoing. Notes for the reviewing officer: do not mistake endurance for weakness. Do not mistake patience for submission. Do not mistake a ship you do not recognize for a ship you understand. Above all, do not mistake the first thing a human says to you for the most important thing a human says to you. Listen for the second thing. That is where they tell you who they actually are. At the bottom of the entry, someone had added a single line in handwriting that the archivists had eventually traced to Fleet Commander Torathan, added on the day he retired from Velhari military service after 41 years. On the same day that the first permanent joint human Velhari diplomatic station opened at the Proxima Reach, built, by agreement, exactly at the coordinates where the Unbroken Resolve had once sat alone against 7 cruisers and chosen conversation over catastrophe. The line read, they thought it was a scout ship. It was a human warship. The difference between those two things is the difference between the galaxy we had and the galaxy we are building. I am glad, in the end, that I listened. The end.